Great. For the record, I'm not a professor, I'm a research scientist. I'm very low on the totem pole. Well, thank you very much to InterVarsity for giving me the chance to speak this week again. As usual, I have about 2 hours of material and about 30 minutes in which to present it, so I'm going to go really fast and just dive right in. I'm here today to talk about whether there is evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And so here's my talk outline. I want to begin by asking, what is a miracle? And are miracles even possible? Because if miracles are impossible, there's no need to even look at the evidence for the resurrection, right? Because the resurrection is, after all, the central miracle of the Christian faith. I want to then talk about the evidence for the resurrection, but I don't want to stop there. I think too often Christians can stop with just presenting the evidence. I want to also talk about the meaning of the resurrection, and finally present some conclusions for both Christians and non-Christians in the audience. Let's begin by asking, what is a miracle? And I want to say that we usually define miracles as violations of the laws of nature, and this is a very problematic definition for several reasons. Number one, if you were here last week, we spent a long time talking about how, according to quantum mechanics, the laws of nature don't render anything strictly impossible. So this is really a meaningless definition, no matter how wild the event might be, like man-eating dragons flying out of a particle accelerator. That's not impossible, strictly speaking, according to quantum mechanics. But second of all, I would say this is not the biblical view of miracles. If you look, for instance, at Exodus 14, one of the central miracles of the Old Testament was the parting of the Red Sea. But God used natural means to bring about that event. If you look at the actual explicit statement in the text, God brought about a strong wind to part the Red Sea. Now, did God cause the wind to come about? Of course. But he used natural means to accomplish his purposes. So I want to say we shouldn't be naive and just say, well, miracles are just clear violations of natural laws. That's a problematic definition. Instead, I want to say that a miracle is a special act of God which functions as a sign. What do I mean by special? Well, I mean out of the ordinary. This is what we think about when we think about the miraculous. It's certainly something that evokes awe and wonder in people who see it. But second, it's an act of God. Of course, God is the one who performs the miracle. It's supernaturally caused. But finally, this is extremely important. It functions as a sign. Miracles in the Bible are never content-free. They're not just magic tricks. They always accompany a very specific message about God, about his attributes, about his saving purposes. And so I think that this understanding of a miracle is much more consistent with a biblical witness. So second then, let's ask the question, are miracles even possible? And I would say that it's really problematic to simply say that miracles are impossible. First of all, you could say, well, God can't intervene in nature because then natural laws would be violated. And I would say, again, you have to go back and think about quantum mechanics. Even if we accepted that miracles are a violation of natural laws, which is a bad definition, this would not be true given what we know about quantum mechanics. Second of all, you could say, well, God does not intervene in nature. He could, but he doesn't. And then I'd have to ask you, well, how do you know this? Did God reveal this to you? Because if he did, he'd have to intervene in nature to reveal this to you. So it really is, it's an untenable position to say that God does not intervene in nature. You can't know that. And third, you could say, well, God, he just wouldn't intervene in nature. And I think this often masks what is a poor understanding of what Christians and Jews and Muslims talk about when they talk about God's transcendence. To monotheists, generally speaking, God is transcendent, meaning that he is separate, apart, beyond nature. He's not inside of it. And as such, he's not constrained by the laws of nature, any more than a novelist is constrained by the laws of his novel. For instance, I could write a novel in which gravity made everyone fall upwards. But the characters in my novel couldn't say to me, wait a minute, why are you standing on the floor? You have to fall upwards. Because I'm not constrained by the laws of the novel that I myself wrote. In the same way, God is not subject to the laws of nature that he himself created. Or similarly, God can act as a causal agent in nature without violating natural laws. Here's an example of this. Imagine my friend takes me up to the roof of his house, and to demonstrate the law of gravity, he drops the ball off of the roof and hits the ground 1 second later. He does that 1,000,000 times. And then I say to him, if you drop that ball again, it's going to take 100 seconds to reach the ground. He says, no, it took 1 second the last 1,000,000 times. That's impossible. That would violate the law of gravity. I said, well, just try it. So he drops the ball, and I snatch it. I wait 99 seconds, and I let it go, and it hits the ground 1 second later. Now, have I violated the law of gravity? No, of course not. but I've introduced an outside factor. I am a causal agent that intervenes in the system and causes the natural course of events to be interrupted. In the same way, God can intervene in nature without in any way violating the laws of nature because he's outside of nature. Okay, so I would recommend that we keep an open-minded attitude towards miracles. We shouldn't just say they're impossible. Number one, if you're an agnostic, you just say, well, I don't know if God exists. Well, then you definitely need to have an open-minded attitude towards every occurrence of miracles, because you can't know that miracles exist or not. If God might or might not exist, then miracles might or might not occur. We'll skip the human objection. One thing you often hear is that, well, if you believe that miracles can occur, then you have to believe that every miracle occurred. Well, that's just silly. That's like saying if you believe that Barack Obama won the last presidential election, you have to believe that everyone won the last presidential election. Well, that's just a non sequitur. You can believe that some miracle claims are credible and that miracles might have happened in certain cases historically and not in other cases. But finally, and this is, again, very important, just because we believe that miracles are possible doesn't mean they happen all the time. And I'm going to borrow a phrase from C.S. Lewis here, who said we ought to look for miracles at the great ganglia of history. What he meant was that if you have a generally biblical worldview, or even just a sort of generally theistic worldview, you should expect to see miracles not scattered randomly through human history, but at great turning points in history where you might expect God to intervene. Okay, so having laid out that discussion of miracles, let's look at the evidence for the resurrection. And let me give you a brief background on Jesus himself, for those who might not have this kind of background. So what I'm going to say here is not at all controversial. This is what you'll hear from all historians. I quoted Bart Ehrman here. Ehrman is a former Christian, now an agnostic, who routinely debates against Christians, arguing against the historicity of the Bible, against the resurrection. And he basically affirms these facts, that Jesus was born around 4 BC in Roman-occupied Palestine. He was known as a teacher and a healer. He was known as those things. He might not have been an actual healer, but he certainly had the reputation. He associated with prostitutes and social outcasts. Before his death, he went into Jerusalem and came into conflict with the religious leaders in Jerusalem. And he was executed by the Romans under Pontius Pilate around 33 AD. And again, these are all non-controversial facts. Ehrman, he teaches at UNC, and this is from a quote from his the New Testament, his textbook on the New Testament. Okay, so that's the background. Now, the Christian claim, though, is that after Jesus was executed on the cross, 3 days later, he rose again from the dead. That is the miracle claim that's central to Christianity. So now I want to go through some pieces of evidence, historical evidence, that actually support that claim, that Christian miracle claim. And there are several here. Now, I want to point out that these four facts are actually agreed upon by the majority of New Testament scholars, both liberal and conservative, of all different backgrounds, atheist, agnostic, Jewish, Christian, Muslim. Now, I'm not saying there's complete unanimity. There's not. But the majority of people who've written on these topics affirm these four facts. Where they differ is in the interpretation, the best explanation for these four facts. So let me go through those four now and talk a little bit about the implausibility of the other alternative explanation, which I think is a very powerful argument in itself. So first, Jesus' burial and the empty tomb are both likely to be historical facts. Number one, in the Gospels, it is said that Jesus was buried by a man named Joseph of Arimathea, who is a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin. Now, the Jewish Sanhedrin was the Jewish religious council that ordered Jesus to be executed. So this is a very strange thing for the early Christians to invent. The Sanhedrin were their enemies. They were not friendly to Christians. So why would Christians just make up a prominent person and say, he's the one who buried Jesus? The member of our enemies. That would be an odd thing for them to just fabricate out of nowhere. Second, the discovery of the empty tomb by women is unlikely to be an invention. Now, why is that? Well, to us it doesn't seem unlikely, but to a first century audience, whether Jewish or Gentile, it would have been very strange, because women were not held in high esteem in the first century world. For instance, the Jewish historian Josephus says that they were not even allowed to give testimony in court. It was inadmissible. But regardless, they were certainly held in lower esteem than men. So if that were the case, why would you invent the discovery of the empty tomb? Why would you invent women as the first witnesses of the empty tomb? Why not men? But more than that, why would you invent Mary Magdalene? She's mentioned in the Gospels as one of the key witnesses of the empty tomb. But she was also mentioned in the Gospels as being one who was formerly demon-possessed. this is not exactly a star witness. So if you were inventing some credible witnesses, you would not make up women, and then one of them happened to be a former demoniac, right? But that's what they claim saw the empty tomb first. This is interesting. In Matthew's gospel, Matthew contains a debate between the early Christians and the Jewish leaders over the resurrection. The Christians were going around claiming, Jesus rose from the dead, his tomb's empty. And what did the Jewish authorities say in response? They said, well, that's because you stole the body. And the Christians said, well, no, there was a Roman guard there. We couldn't have stolen the body. Now, what's interesting here is that this argument presumes that there was an empty tomb. Why would the Jewish authorities claim that that the disciples stole the body if the tomb was not empty? That's interesting. Again, now did Matthew make that up so that 20 centuries later we'd think back and say, wow, that's really puzzling? No, the more plausible explanation is the Jewish authorities really were saying you stole the body because there really was an empty tomb. And now the empty tomb is implied by Paul's statement in 1 Corinthians 15. This is a letter written by Paul about 25 years after Jesus' death. It's about a little before 60 AD, maybe after, we're not sure. But scholars unanimously agree it was written by Paul. It's extremely early. And they even think he may have been citing, actually they agree that he was citing an earlier creed that may be traced to within 7 years of Jesus' death. That's around 42 AD, maybe even 6 months within Jesus' death. It's an extremely early creedal statement. But in that creedal statement, Paul says that Jesus was buried and he was raised. Now, to a first century Jew, the phrase was raised, the Greek there implies a bodily resurrection. You would never say that someone was raised, then ask the question, was the tomb empty? That's implied in the word that's used for raised. So again, that traces back very early within the Christian history. And finally, if you take Acts to be generally historically reliable, a reliable account of the apostles' preaching, then it records the fact that they began preaching Jesus' resurrection only 50 days after his death in Jerusalem itself. And they even had the audacity to mention the empty tomb and say, well, Jesus' tomb is empty, but David's isn't. So they explicitly mention it. Now, how could they have done that sort of within the same city in which the resurrection occurred if the tomb was actually there with Jesus' decomposing remains? Again, extremely unlikely. So all these reasons are why generally the majority of scholars, not all, but the majority of scholars, affirm the existence of both the burial and the empty tomb. Second, Jesus was reported to have been seen after his death. And this spans a lot of different people in a lot of different settings over many weeks. And it's not just that the disciples had visions of Jesus. They report that they'd actually touched him, they'd even eaten with him. Right? So we're talking about a bodily, physical resurrection. In 1 Corinthians, Paul says that there are 500 people who saw Jesus alive, many of whom are still alive, and presumably you could question if the Corinthians wanted to. And now again, we're not claiming here that they were necessarily telling the truth. All we're saying, or that they were reporting an actual physical resurrection. We're just saying they claimed to have had these experiences. And in fact, again, Ehrman here says that with complete certainty, we can say that some of his disciples claimed to have seen Jesus physically raised from the dead. They made that claim. Okay, that's basically historically certain.